Don't do drugs. If you're doing it, stop it. Get some help.
The NBA and narcotics have a sordid past, most of which the league would be happy to sweep under the rug.
Zach Randolph was arrested on a drug possession charge.
Popular stories most know are those like Len Bias, the college prodigy who was drafted at 2nd overall in '86 to the Celtics and had a heart attack on draft night.
All-star Len Bias, it confirms the worst suspicions. He died of heart failure because he used cocaine.
Or the fact that the Los Angeles Times estimated that 40 to 75% of players during the 70s and early 80s used cocaine. Not to mention an estimated 1 out of 10 smoked or freebased the drug. These figures were actually leaked by then Hawks GM Stan Kasten, but quotes from other teams highlight the issue, although maybe diminish the fractions a little bit. Kasten was actually the youngest GM in pro sports at the time, getting the job in 1979 at just 27 years old, taking the title formerly held by then Suns GM Jerry Colangelo. Utah Jazz GM Frank Layden was quoted as saying, "There's not a team in the league you can confidently say does not have a drug problem. Every team could benefit from a rehab program. I had 2 cases out of 11 players last year. We need a place to send these people."
Drugs and the NBA do not mix. If you want to get involved in drugs, you will not be involved with the NBA.
The NBA Drug Act was put forward in '83 in an attempt to curb the behavior and get things back on track behind the scenes.
The NBA program against drug abuse is by far the toughest in all the professional sports tainted by drug scandals.
David Stern also took over as commissioner in '84 with a hard-nosed approach to any drug offense within the league. But as we'll soon find out, few rules and laws weren't enough to deter a special group of players. 6 current and former NBA players would be indicted on charges of conspiracy to traffic narcotics in April 1987, and another 5 players were named in the indictment without charges. What did these players all have in common? They all played for the Phoenix Suns. It's time to take a look at the single biggest drug bust in pro sports history, and the chaos that was the '86-'87 Phoenix Suns. They were led by longtime Suns veteran guard Walter Davis, Larry Nance, and Jay Humpries. They had a young and recently drafted Jeff Hornacek on the bench, who was still a few years from getting a proper role on offense. The season started in a feel-good fashion, seeing the very first NBA game played on indigenous territory, with the Suns taking on the Mavericks on October 9th in Kikotsmovi Village, Arizona, a Hopi reservation about 4 hours out from Phoenix. They played in front of a 3,300 standing room only crowd, and by all reports, the players were touched and thought it was a beautiful experience. Second-year fringe player Nick Vanos sent emphatic blocks to the crowd and hung around to sign autographs after. Veteran Alvin Adams spoke to all who would listen to him about the Hopi and Navajo culture while on the team bus back to Flagstaff. Well, everyone except rookie Sun center William Bedford from Memphis State, who put his foot in his mouth with this quote, "I thought it was going to be in a town, not in an open area with just one building," going on to say, "I thought I played fair, but I think I'll have a better time playing in front of Americans." Well, Bedford was wrong about that one. After 6 seasons in the NBA, he only averaged 4.1 points and 2.4 rebounds per game, a little bit lower than his 14.8 rebound showing in Kikotsmovi. He also missed the full 88-89 season because of substance abuse. Bedford played 3 years at Memphis State and was involved in a scandal involving numerous NCAA violations, resulting in a 2-year probation for the school and the return of $1 million of prize money. It all started when he crashed a Jaguar loaned to him by a booster, the same booster who gambled with the Memphis State head coach, Dana Gray Kirk, at a local country club. This garnered the attention of federal authorities, who launched a gambling and point-shaving investigation at the school without turning anything up. An interesting tidbit that will certainly come back into play later. Bedford entered the draft early because of the investigation and was taken 6th overall in 1986 by the Suns. The The Suns would start that season with 13-year veteran head coach John McLeod, one of the longest tenured coaches in the NBA at the time, and a stalwart in Arizona. Despite John still to this day having the most wins in Suns head coach history, that season got off to a rough start at 22-34. And that Suns team was about as streaky as you could get. In the first full month of basketball, they went on a 4-game losing streak, a 3-game winning streak, before going on another 3-game losing streak to close out the month. That win streak included a 30-point walloping over a strong 76ers team and future Phoenix Sun Charles Barkley. That Philadelphia team would go on to finish second in the East. It's almost as if their erratic play could be attributed to some outside factor, but by December 10th, 1986, they'd clawed their way back to 10-10. Elsewhere around the league, drug use continued to be a common news item. Houston Rockets players Mitchell Wiggins and Louis Lloyd received a lifetime ban on January 13, 1987, after they both failed urine tests and neglected to turn themselves in beforehand. Later that month, on January 29th, Golden State rookie Chris Washburn admitted to cocaine use and asked to be checked into a rehab center. The NBA implemented a caveat that admitting to your own usage would prevent a lifetime ban. The Suns organization were no strangers to issues with drugs, and about a year ago their star guard Walter Davis sent ripples across the league when similarly he checked himself into rehab for cocaine and alcohol abuse. Here are the NBA incidents related to cocaine that occurred between that window. As you can see, the league was busy. It was the morning of December 12, 1985 at the Hyatt Hotel in Oakland, California. Davis has just scored a career high last night against the Warriors with 43 points in a 123-113 win, but was in a mood far from jubilant. Oakland was notorious for their cocaine traffickers in the 80s, and the Warriors were plagued with cases like Bernard King, Michael Ray Richardson, and John Lucas.
There's a shooting war in Oakland, a deadly battle for turf between drug dealers, police, and citizens.
As newspapers at the time quoted, the Oakland Hyatt was seen as the best place in the league to score drugs, so struggling players routinely fell off the wagon during their Golden State trip. And now, we bring you back to February 1987. The Suns started the month at 19-27, and they had the 6th worst record in the league. They were wrought with injuries, including their veteran starting center, James Edwards. Edwards went out in late November with an Achilles injury, eventually requiring surgery that past December. With 8 to 12 weeks of recovery expected, Edwards found himself sidelined for the foreseeable future, but still attending team meetings and functions. The injured Edwards was known to be a regular at a few Phoenix nightclubs with a group of select Suns players. They went so often that it was reported that James and 2 other NBA players were seen at a club named Malarkey's 2 days before a home game against the Milwaukee Bucks on February 21st, 1987. According to a testimony by the bartender Charles Keenan, Edwards claimed to the nightclub manager James J. Jordan that the game would not exceed 226 points. This got complicated when further claims suggest that the 2 other NBA players were members of the opposing Bucks, Jack Sikma and Paul McKeskey. Betting on your own NBA game, now that's one thing. Adding to the fact that you're aiming for a loss and the under, even more reviled. Conspiring with members of the other team to do so, it was practically unheard of. When later pressed about the outing, they admitted going there to shoot the breeze, and briefly speaking with James Edwards, but only kept the conversation to his Achilles injury. Sikma said he had no knowledge of anything unusual going on that night. A report from the Mesa Tribune alleged that McKeskey was given $100 worth of cocaine from manager James J. Jordan. Things grew stranger when Bucks player McKeskey admitted to previously knowing the manager of Malarkey's, James J. Jordan, and said the two had golfed in Hawaii together previously. For a Spokane, Washington-born player who was drafted to the Rockets and never played in Phoenix, forming a tight bond with an Arizona nightclub owner seems odd. McKeskey said he had met Jordan during the offseason and that he went into Jordan's office to look over pictures from the trip, which raises the curious question, who else was on that trip? Oh, and the Suns would lose that game, by the way, and what a coincidence. The total points in the game would only finish out to 222, below 226 like Edwards predicted, and reportedly, thousands of people in the know would bet. February was a tough month for that Suns team. They would follow up their Bucks loss by sliding into a season-low 5-game losing streak. To be fair, 2 of those recent losses included tight contests with the Showtime Lakers, but some nights they seemed to be just off. It's hard to be sure if it was a matter of mid-season fatigue, lack of talent, or off-court extracurriculars cutting into their harmony. I suspect that GM Jerry Colangelo knew that his longtime coach of 14 seasons had lost control of the room in more ways than one. Whatever was going on behind the scenes, on Friday, February 27, 1987, Coach John McLeod was let go, with Colangelo saying the time has come for a change. Maybe he meant that in more ways than one. He was replaced with Dick Van Arsdale, a former Suns player that was taken in the expansion draft of '68, and at the time was the Suns color commentator for TV and radio. Funny enough, Van Arsdale would replace the same coach who brought him to the finals in '76, but only one problem. He had never coached before in his life. Those 26 games would be the only ones he coached in his career, and the original Sun returned behind the scenes after season's end. On-court performance was the last of their worries. Unbeknownst to any members of the Suns or general public, the Maricopa County Police had already begun a gambling and racketeering investigation in February involving 2 central parties, the nightclub Malarkeys and the Phoenix Suns. It was alleged that NBA officials wanted to test the offending players immediately, but the county police refused, saying it would interfere with the investigation. On March 3rd, a Maricopa County grand jury indicted 5 men on racketeering and bookmaking charges, including Charles Keenan, Terrence Patrick Kelly, and Ramon Vives, both from Avanti, a restaurant that some players from the Suns frequented. The additional 2 were James J. Jordan, the manager of Malarkey's, and Joseph A. Benianato, the Suns' photographer. The accounts given by Keenan and Kelly would be exactly what authorities needed to begin swooping down and bring the first Phoenix players into custody. It is suspected that the first Phoenix Sun brought in was the one police knew had previous ties to cocaine usage and had the most info about local dealers. Whether they knew it or not, Davis was 1 infraction away from a lifetime ban from the NBA and certainly had the most to lose in that locker room. It was reported that when Davis entered police custody, he became immediately compliant. Colangelo may have taken the heat off his team a bit by taking the spotlight himself, collecting a fine during the last part of the season for forcing his home announcer to highlight the disparity in fouls in a game versus the Lakers, saying, "The Suns have 8 fouls, the Lakers have none." Being the same person that famously choked a ref mid-game after Earl Strom said he could take him, it's not too surprising. Here's Jerry recounting the incident himself.
To the table, he grabbed his water and he's looking right at me and he says, "I can take you." And when he said that, I leaped across the table and grabbed him by the neck.
By the time April 8 came around, just 10 days before season's end, the Arizona Republic would release an earth-shattering report on rumors of an ongoing drug investigation within the NBA and the Phoenix Suns, including a tidbit about requesting videotape of the Suns game for evaluation. Another note said that the Arizona DA had already turned over information to the NBA, implicating some members of the Suns. Colangelo wasn't in Phoenix at the time and stressed he couldn't comment any further. Curiously enough, he was in the same place that McKeskey from the Bucks met James J. Jordan from Malarkey's, Hawaii. A report filtered out on April 10th that seemed to pour more gas on the fire. The Arizona Republic said that Phoenix police had acquired search warrants to seize several score sheets from the Suns' offices. The game tape that NBA officials were requesting was from February 21st, when the Suns played the Bucks, and they lost. The report claimed that 3 active players were the primary subject of the investigation, but wouldn't name who. The last thread that seemed to connect nearly everything together was the apparent center of the probe, a gambling ring in Oakland, California, a familiar place for a lot of the players who indulged. Despite an active police investigation going on, the team would actually go 14-12 the rest of the year and miss the playoffs by just a single game. They were still erratic as ever, and closed off the year with both a 7-game losing streak and a 7-game winning streak. On April 17th, and the day before the last game of the season, the Maricopa County Attorney's Office officially announced indictments against 13 individuals in a cocaine trafficking investigation. As the sporting world turned their attention to Phoenix, you could sense the house of cards finally falling down. Of the 13 people named, 3 were active Suns players, James Edwards, Jay Humpries, and Grant Gondrezick. 2 former players, Garfield Hurd and Mike Bratz, were also charged. To round out the final 8, a slew of Suns-associated persons were named at varying level of charges, most notably the team's photographer and William Bedford's roommate. The final pieces of the puzzle were Wynn and Kim Leisure, 2 brothers from New River, Arizona, who were named as the primary cocaine dealer to the Suns for the last decade. The Leisures were directly named in indictments as providing drugs to Don Buse, Johnny High, Alvin Scott, Curtis Perry, and Walter Davis. They even sold drugs to the Suns' very first draft pick from '69, Neil Walk. It's almost as if Wynn Leisure was also one of the original Suns. A few names that seem to be glaring omissions in the indictments were Walter Davis, William Bedford, and former Suns player Johnny High. Yes, that was his real name. It is assumed that these 3 individuals received immunity for testifying. Unbelievably, bench-riding rookie Grant Gondrezick and Jay Humpries would play the next day, a 121-106 win against the LA Clippers, despite the charges hanging over their heads. Bedford was out with an injury, so he was a non-issue. Davis was suspended by the league and reacted to the news by checking himself into a rehab center, a mandatory step from the league. The season ended with a lot of questions still on the table. The 3 active Suns players were awaiting drug tests from the league. A failure would mean a lifetime ban for all 3, not to mention the pending charges that all 13 members of the indictment faced. It was no surprise to any when the 3 of them passed the tests, since they had known about the investigation for almost 3 weeks at that point. Edwards, Hurd, Humpries, and Gondrezick all pled innocent on April 30th and awaited deliberation from the courts. Former Suns guard Mike Bratz was in California at the time and required extradition to be tried in Arizona. Bratz would probably get off the lightest of any of them. After being found innocent by local California courts, he would remain in California for the entire summer. Whether they were caught up in the indictments of the other 12 or just inept, Bratz would get off scot-free for half of his charges when prosecutors in Phoenix failed to file the required paperwork, and the final 2 charges were dismissed after a confusing 6 months. The scandal was even dubbed Waltergate by the media, focusing on the Suns star Walter Davis, who was cemented firmly in the middle of the investigation. When pressed by the media about the potential immunity granted for testifying, Davis seemed forlorn and relayed that he had no choice, going on to say that if he knew what would happen to his friends and teammates, he would never have done so. The web of players implicated by Davis and his initial confession was staggering, whether it was directly or indirectly. It included players from the Suns, Bucks, Rockets, Celtics, and Supersonics, 17 former and current NBA players. The case of the prosecution began to crumble away as the press leaked details of their case. Key witness and former Sun, Alvin Scott, recanted his statement about Garfield Hurd providing the supply, now saying that Davis in fact did. The only actual evidence against Walter Davis was a Channel 12 interview with KPNX TV, where he admits to using cocaine, but at this point, he had immunity. Even further, it was revealed that the prosecution lawyers collected evidence by wiring bartender Charles Keenan with a hidden microphone in a conversation with Malarkey's manager, James J. Jordan. The conversation revealed Jordan admitting the fact he had supplied Davis with cocaine and placed a bet on the February 21st game against the Bucks. Given the fact that this was conducted by the attorney's office without the involvement of law enforcement and involved a key witness, tapes were inadmissible in court. All of these individuals charged would essentially coast free because of the botched aspects of the investigation. Kevin Merriweather was charged with obstructing a criminal investigation for attempting to lie to officers about his roommate's whereabouts, William Bedford. As it turns out, Kevin was also the son of one of Bedford's agents, Will Merriweather. Grant Gondrezick would be invited back to camp that next year, but his career trajectory was never the same. Despite being a second-round pick and initially projected for a minor role, he actually played in 64 games that year and showed some value as a reserve guard. Gondrezick was cut from the team in the '87 training camp, and in response to his chances on landing on another NBA roster, he said, "No team wants to touch me." Grant was facing 3 charges in total and pled guilty to interfering with a criminal investigation in exchange for a plea bargain deal to reduce his sentence to 3 years of probation. 1987 was tough for Gondrezick. The same month he faced a grand jury for 3 charges. His brother Glenn, and 6-year NBA veteran, made headlines with an attempted suicide attempt using a handgun after his wife announced she was divorcing him. Grant would only play another 27 games in the NBA for the LA Clippers next season, failing to earn a permanent role. He would ride his career into the sunset in Europe, with a few notable stops in France. Here is Grant making a big 3 against CSKA Moscow in a EuroLeague playoff. His last flash in the headlines was in 2009 for a second indictment, where he was part of a mortgage fraud scheme from 2004 to 2005 for almost $12 million in funds. Gondrezick passed away in 2021, but his daughter Kaiser, and former WNBA player, has taken over headlines recently for her legal battles with boyfriend Kevin Porter Jr. Tragedy seemed to shadow the Suns for the rest of 1987. Former Suns player and one of the key witnesses in the indictment was Johnny High, who tragically crashed his car while under the influence on June 21st, 1987, and passed away shortly after. And it didn't stop there. On August 16th, Suns center Nick Vanos and his girlfriend Carolyn Cohen were traveling to Detroit when the unthinkable happened. Their Northwest Airlines flight from Phoenix, somewhere over Denver, crashed, and all passengers aboard would perish. Vanos was one of the few players not implicated in the scandal, and actually started 12 of the last 15 games of the season. The timing of the scandal couldn't have been worse for Phoenix fans. The end of the season began to spur rumors that Phoenix was at risk for relocation to another city. Owner Richard Block was part of the NBA expansion committee, but there's an ongoing narrative that Phoenix was a problem franchise. They might have been right. In the 12th hour, Jerry Colangelo decided to put forward a massive $44.5 million bid, then a record high for the NBA. The sale finalized on October 16th, just days before the October 19th stock crash, known as Black Monday. Had the deal not been completed prior, Colangelo doubts it would have been completed at all, and that the troubled franchise would have relocated. The rest of the implicated players would fizzle out with no real fanfare. Walter Davis managed to slightly salvage his reputation, but never reached the scoring heights he saw before the scandal. Edwards and Humpries both entered a drug program for a plea bargain. Bedford and Edwards were also shipped off to no place other than Detroit. You could argue that a major reason why the media began to paint that era as the bad boy Pistons was these two. Here's Edwards slapping Ed Nealy during the Eastern Conference Finals. Edwards would finish his career a 3-time NBA champion, and one of the lesser-known names that jumped from the bad boy Pistons to the Jordan Bulls. Here's Edwards getting into another fight with Liddell Eccles, with Steve Kerr attempting to hold him back. Bedford would win a title in 1990, but his career was marred by substance abuse issues that seemed to follow him everywhere after Phoenix. He missed the entire 88-89 season after another drug infraction, during which the Pistons won a championship. His reputation would essentially push him out of the league, and after his NBA career finished in '93, things continued to go downhill. He was arrested twice between '96 and '97 for drug possession. During 2001, he was caught transporting 25 pounds of marijuana in Michigan. Following this charge, he would collect another 2 charges for intent to distribute cocaine, and was handed down a 10-year sentence in prison, eventually being released in November 2011. He had a recent interview with Vlad TV in July 2023, where he talked about his troubles and what ultimately led to his arrest. The Suns' drug scandal would both signify the height of the NBA's problems with cocaine and its eventual fall. The aftermath would send shockwaves through the league, and it seemed like every player had to answer for it. Here's Larry Nance from the Suns addressing it in the preseason preview video sent out to fans.
Get this problem behind us, be one of the first teams that get rid of this problem and never let it happen here again.
The drugs' attention and decline seem to coincide with the sporting world shifting to other things across the league, like a lanky shooting guard on the Chicago Bulls.
Don't do drugs. If you're doing it, stop it. Get some help.